Africa, as we know, has a growing and predominantly young population, and the average age in Africa is under 20. And these factors grow consumer demand and illustrate the urgent need to expand employment opportunities and capacity building across the continent. This is synonymous with every country almost across Africa. So this next session is called Driving Intra-African Trade Through Youth Participation, a very, very important subject matter. Your moderator for this session with some great panelists is Fifi Peters. You may know, and you'll recognize her, certainly her name and her face, because she's a senior broadcast senior anchor at CNBC Africa. Please welcome Fifi Peters.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's interesting we're having a conversation around the youth, and I'm just scouting the room and I'm seeing not a lot of representation of the youth. Problematic. Nonetheless, I am not here to preach to the converted. I think that we all know that Africa is rich in this resource. That is a group of young people, a group of vibrant people, a group of entrepreneurial people who happen to be the largest in the world. We have a golden goose here in this continent, and the question is, how do we get it to lay the golden eggs that will grow our economies and create jobs? And to what degree can boosting business amongst us as Africa help us in that task? So I'm going to welcome the panelists very shortly. But as I was preparing for this discussion, a few examples came to mind about young innovators who are already in action. Aisha Pando, so she's a South African entrepreneur who developed the Uber of cleaning services, as it were. She's presently got about 40,000 active users on her app and has created thousands of jobs for mainly women in this country. We have Katlego Mapai, who is the co-founder of a point-of-sales system called Yoko that has enabled many small merchants to get paid and to also contribute to the revenue service through taxes. I don't know how many of them are happy about that, but nonetheless. And we also have a Nigerian-born entrepreneur, Olukbenga Agbola, the CEO of Flutterwave, which I had the honor to meet. And I say honor because it is the latest unicorn coming from the continent after surpassing a market valuation of over $1 billion earlier this year, after 5 years, of just 5 years in existence. And Flutterwave, as many of you know, enable payments in across countries and in multiple currencies. So we have a lot of examples out there of young people presently in action, probably a lot more, and even more than that on the sidelines, waiting to come into the main frame. And so the conversation we're having amongst each other is, how do we get them to do that? And I hope that you will be free enough to share your thoughts, solutions with us on social media using the hashtag IATF2021. MEC, if you can kick us off as the host of this year's conference. What is your point of departure, sir, in crowding in more young people in business and getting more young people at the Intra-Africa trade table?
Thank you, Fifi, and good day to everyone and my distinguished panelists. I think fortunately the Premier was on the platform just 20 minutes ago, and he spoke about a number of initiatives that we have in KwaZulu-Natal. But before I come to those specifics, I think the Intra-Africa trade, in terms of its macro messaging, has been providing a few key issues. And the first one is information. Just at a very base level, we don't know each other as Africans sufficiently. We don't know, Professor Obasanjo put it quite succinctly when we said we simply don't know what products are being produced in each of our countries so that we can explore the opportunities of trading in them. But more importantly than that, it's clear that we can't be trading in goods that are produced somewhere else. And that brings us to the point of local production and how do we stimulate local production. So in all of that, I think young people have a critical role to play. And the initiative here to have a dedicated youth startup session or panel or pillar, as we call it, is quite important. I was fortunate enough to be at the official opening of the session of young people yesterday, and the dynamism and energy was quite inspiring. And they raised a number of issues. The first would be access to information, mentorship and training, access to finance, business management skills, and then lastly, access to market. Because we find we take people through the first 4 of those pillars, and then they sit with having produced stuff which they're unable to basically sell or trade because we haven't done enough work on the access to markets. And that's where the information gap must be addressed. Here in KwaZulu-Natal, we have 2 or 3 programs. Let's take the agricultural program. Excuse me. Let's take the agricultural program. And I'm sure in all our countries, we have people who are participating in the agriculture at a subsistence level. Now, we have a program that seeks to take them from subsistence level to small holding level and then to commercial farming. Now, that requires detailed plans and inputs at each of those levels. So the agricultural department, for example, will give support in respect of seeds, fertilizer, irrigation systems to be able to emerge from that subsistence levels. Then when you go to the small holding level and your produce is more than what you need and more than you need to sell to your neighbors and you need access to markets, then we've been able to approach big chain stores and say, what commitment are you making to take stock from this particular sector? And they have. And then there's the logistics of getting that produce from the field to the shelf in an efficient timeline in particular. So that's a lot of nitty-gritty work that needs to be done as far as that is concerned. Then we have young people, and the Premier spoke about Operation Vula. There we've sought to use our public procurement. Like, for example, we spend in this province probably up to 10 billion rand on basic stuff which is required by government, whether it's toilet paper or detergents and the like. And we've identified those products and said, we will guarantee this market for you if you're going to be able to produce it. And again, we give support along the value chain to be able to them to access that market. Again,
I like how you've listed some of the challenges in crowding in more youth involvement in terms of the fact that we don't know each other well enough as Africans. COVID probably made things worse because we couldn't see each other and travel around, but nonetheless, hopefully things are on the road to getting better. The fact that not enough of the goods are manufactured here on the continent. You spoke about the lack of access to sufficient finance as well as markets. And it is encouraging to hear a bit about what KZN is doing to try to facilitate that. And we'll hear a little bit more about that, sir. Dr. Maxim, just to get opening thoughts from you, sir. You're in a division that represents a group of young people that were by far the hardest hit as a result of this pandemic, women. Talk to us about your point of departure in finding a solution to develop this group of young people and enable them through some form of empowerment, be it via employment or be it via becoming employers themselves, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me take you, in my country they say when you fall down, don't look at what happens at the place where you fall. Step back and see where you slipped. And that place might be a little bit far from where you actually fall down. And that was happening to women when we start this conversation. We need to know where women are coming from. When you meet a woman in business, you step back to her house, you step back to her environment, and what you see, you don't like. And when you see that woman competing in the business environment, she deploys like 3 times more effort than a typical other young person. Now, the reason why the conversation that we are having about young people is very, very important is that we will notice that business is being hampered in the region by conflicts. It's being hampered by a lot of other things, like manifestation we see in Nigeria, in South Africa, young people on the street. Why? Because there is a gap in the economy that our policy environment is not helping. So a lot of people will be talking about demographic dividend, trying to build on the youth. UN Women has done a study in 3 countries in the region on what is hampering women's businesses. And we have seen issues like technology, we have seen issues like finance, markets, but more importantly, policy. And no matter how you take it, there is obvious gap that needs to be filled. Let me take one example before talking about policy. In the technological area, we've seen the increased importance of the digital sector in the economy. And when you look at the digital sector, you see the gap between men and women in terms of understanding, number 2, influencing, number 3, benefiting from what government is doing in the area of improving digital environments. UN Women has started a program, very interesting program called Young Girls Can Code. And that program in 17 countries on the continent has shown a huge level, a demand, people hungry for that type of things for girls. A typical father today will be wondering, what is my girl going to do? And I'm saying typical father on purpose. Now, when you talk policy, to quickly finish on my introduction, what we have seen is half policies. What I call half policies is like you close your border, like we do most of the time in big countries like Nigeria, to protect local producers. But you don't put in place policies that is going to support them technically, like any kind of accompaniment measure. So the fact that you protect them without developing them is what I call half policy. You can have, for instance, a tax incentive for a category of business people, including young people or women. But that tax incentive needed 2 or 3 other policies to function, but you see that those policies are missing. So the report that UN Women did puts in evidence these kind of gaps that we have seen in the region.
All right. Very interesting dynamic there, particularly regarding protection without development. And I think it's food for a thought. Perhaps we'll flesh into how we can introduce more developmental ideas or initiatives or policies in the next round. Honorable Suko, sir, can you just give us a sense of what is happening in Cross River State and the strategy that your government is employing in enabling a lot more young-run businesses?
Thank you very much. Good morning. Let me start by giving out some numbers. The theme of this is youth inclusion in the trade agreement. The African Union Youth Charter defines the youth between the ages of 15 and 35. On the continent today, there are approximately 1 billion people below the age of 35. That means between the ages of 0 and 15 years, you have 541 million people. Between the ages of 15 and 35, you have 455 million people. What that means is that over 70% of the population of Africa are the youth, or they belong to the youth demographic. So this free trade agreement is about the youth, and the youth must be included. There must be need for capacity building and development to ensure that they have adequate participation in this trade agreement. Now, to come home to Cross River State, what are we doing? The governor of Cross River State has, His Excellency Senator Professor Ben Ayade, has understood that most of the challenges we have is the non-utilization of the youth factor in our economy. One of the easiest ways to utilize the high levels of energy young people have beyond technology is, and as cheaply as possible, would be in the agricultural sector. What are the usual challenges to entry? What are the barriers to entry in agriculture? Today, there's a preponderance of subsistence farming in Africa, in the area of agriculture. So what the governor is trying to do is to try and develop mechanized farming, large-scale farming, to ensure that there's efficient and effective output. The usual barriers to entering mechanized farming is the acquisition of land, large-scale land preparation, working capital, and the machinery required. So what the governor has done was to identify young people that are interested in agriculture and start a capacity building program to develop their skills and their abilities, gone further to acquire large parcels of land, parcellate them, as well as develop them and prepare them. Beyond that, allocating them to young people, providing inputs, working capital, with a 360 model whereby we off-take some of this produce from them to the state-owned industries. We have state-owned industries in Cross River State, such as the cocoa processing mill, one of the largest in West Africa, the rice processing mill, one of the largest in West Africa as well, and a cassava processing mill that is currently being developed. Now, this is the model that has been developed by His Excellency, and the state has started the process of implementation. One of the challenges that we have are adequate capital to drive this process. But once you can develop a model such as this that is 360 in nature and channel the energies of our young people into that, you find that there's going to be positive growth in the local economy.
All right. Perhaps we can talk about maybe what you're doing to address the challenge regarding scaling up through more capital in the next round. But Modu, your role is very interesting, and I'm not asking you a question around your role within the Tony Blair Institute, but more specifically, you sit on the board of the Youth Advisory Table at the AfCFTA. I've never met a young person on the board. I didn't even know that they had one, and so it's quite encouraging to hear that they do. But as young people, what are you guys bringing to the table in terms of solutions in crowding in more youth participation in business? And are you being taken seriously in tabling those solutions?
Wow. Wow, I mean, those questions are enough to write a dissertation in terms of the breadth and the sort of, how much needs to be covered there, but I'll try to be succinct. I think the key thing, I'll start with the Youth Forum. It's sort of an example of how, we took the initiative. It was founded by someone who's become a friend of mine, Lerato, who's from South Africa. And it was essentially meant to hold the AfCFTA Secretariat accountable for decisions that are made around the futures and the presence of young people in a way that takes their interests into consideration, but not only into consideration, but giving us a seat at the table, as you alluded to. Now, what we're trying to do is ensure that while we're holding them accountable, we also hold ourselves accountable, because we're trying to have a shift in terms of the mindset in the way young people relate to these institutions and vice versa. So we don't want to have a situation where, you book 2 tickets or so to a conference for us to speak and we're happy and we go home and we clap for ourselves. We want a situation where we're able to sit at the table as equal partners at the highest levels of these multilateral institutions and national governments to be able to advise governments in terms of what is in our own interest. Because as we know, governments and these institutions, particularly on the African continent, are predominantly populated by, and no offense, by older men. And there's the gender aspect there as well. So that's what we're trying to shift. It's not easy. Obviously, we, at the moment, don't have funding to do that. But we're working towards sort of building our structures because we also need to come correct. And we recognize that. Now, shifting over to the Tony Blair Institute, which is sort of my day job, that's where I work. What we look to do is, we talk about, our slogan is making globalization work for the many, not the few. And essentially, that means looking at marginalized groups, and young people are oftentimes marginalized on the continent. So we look at inclusive policies and how we can push governments, and this is going to sound like brand slogans, but to be bold, pragmatic, and progressive in their outlook towards policy making, towards building institutions and structures. And once you have that approach, you're able to see transformative policies being put in place. And for me, I'm not as much, it might be revealing my background in terms of my development economics background, but I'm not so interested in some of these token things that are done for young people. I'm interested in real empowerment. And that comes in the shape of supporting young people, putting them in places both in terms of governance and the economy, where they're able to empower themselves and empower other people. We've seen it, across the continent in places like Nigeria, Kenya, where young people are literally changing how we do things across the continent. So if you give them more opportunity in terms of financial backing, training, and also give them opportunities in governance. I mean, there are not many people my age who have the privilege of doing what I do, which is having direct access to advise governments on what to do. And that needs to change. We need a critical mass of young people that are competent, passionate, and committed to be able to make these things change and to inject some innovation and energy, frankly, into our policy making. Thanks.
I couldn't agree with you more. Let's take the experience of what we're trying to do as a continent outside of the continent and draw some lessons from a region that has been united for many, many years, although there's been a bit of fragmentation in that unification of late, with a couple of countries wanting to leave the European Union. But nonetheless, Roberta, if you can just perhaps share experiences from what was achieved under the EU and what we can draw lessons from as a continent in terms of facilitating the development of more young people in more meaningful roles and more influential roles, both in business and government.
So first, thank you very much for having us here. First, Motengil has 95% of its workforce as Africans, and therefore being in 16 countries, we started realizing there was significant difficulties in mobility within the continent. So when we were challenged to come to this conference, we actually thought about our own experience and also my past experience as a student youth leader many years ago. And one of the examples I think about is always the Erasmus program in Europe, where you actually incentivized close to 6 million students to interchange across the continent. The first, which gives us a proof and an evidence of how Europeans, the younger they are, they see themselves as Europeans rather than nationals. The second one is the harmonization of accreditation. Okay, so the Bologna process guaranteed the harmonization of accreditation, and an engineer here is the same as an engineer there. In Africa, how we are trying to implement that, and we are trying to enhance and foster our workforce, which is the key driver of our success within the continent, is actually foster that mobility. We've been working with several universities. We fostered the protocol between the University of Porto and the University of Rwanda in Kigali. We foster a lot of vocational training and technical training that is required. We've been designing a program for mining operators and mining staff to mobilize, not only if they are today in Mozambique, they will be tomorrow in Guinea and the day after tomorrow in Sudan. So one of the things that lacks the continent, and we have been trying to compensate that by doing ourselves our own programs and bringing our teachings from Europe, is actually to develop programs where Mozambican can easily move to Angola, or like we've been having today, my head of legal is actually a Kenyan lady. So we focus on building up a common accreditation within the organization. Okay, we use now a lot of e-learning platforms. We've fostered procurement plans and logistic plans, and people to have significant vocational and technical training. But again, there's very little that an organization by itself can do. Okay, and I think these initiatives should actually be fostered between the academia and the corporate world to guarantee that Africa has the leaders they need, and Africa has the technicians and the knowledge they need to grab the future in the coming years.
All right. Jennifer, last but not least, ma'am, I mean, quite a lot has been shared so far by your fellow panelists regarding the areas of challenge that they see and some of the solutions on the table regarding what their own individual organizations are doing and some of the blind spots that our government perhaps has in terms of the policy framework, particularly even within the AfCFTA. But what would your point of departure be, ma'am, in actually moving towards a tangible solution for the discussion that we're having about realizing or helping our youth realize their actual potential on this continent?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can.
Well, I represent the African Union Development Agency, and maybe just to share a little bit on its mandate before I go into some of the work we're doing. Through the reform agenda of the African Union, the AUDA-NEPAD has been given a really huge mandate. First of all, to be the agency that pushes for implementation of Agenda 2063. And the issues of youth are very much central to the Agenda 2063. We also are the technical interface for Africa's strategic partners, and we offer advisory services to member states and to regional economic communities on a whole range of development issues. So when it comes to the issues of youth development, particularly entrepreneurship, one of the major projects that we are implementing currently is the 100,000 MSMEs, 100,000 medium, small, and micro enterprise project. Now, this is an unprecedented and scalable digital platform, which has a number of key pillars. We have the MSME Academy, which provides capacity building and training for entrepreneurs. And through this pillar, we have about 13 countries that are on board. We've had 25,000 MSMEs registered, and about 14,000 have participated in online platforms for this capacity building project. Then we have the MSME market, where we are facilitating for entrepreneurs to have access to a much broader market. The other important pillar is the financing, where we are brokering financing for youth-run MSMEs. And we have a partnership project with the EcoBank, which has provided some financing for a number of MSMEs to really upscale their activities and move from informal to more formal, operations in the market. And if I may just add, with the AfCFTA, of course, we all know that this is providing a huge opportunity for Africa. And for us at AUDA-NEPAD, the advisory services that we provide to member states and to the regional economic communities, I think makes it logical that with deeper integration of the regions and stronger regional blocks should translate to continental gains at the level of the AfCFTA.
All right.
Thank you very
Dr.
much.
Maximasi, you want to say something, sir?
Yes, I thank you very much for mentioning these issues that I was alluding to at the beginning of the conversation. In terms of the digital platforms that we are seeing at the moment, there are several divides. I was only referring to one at the beginning. You have the divide between those who have access and those who don't have access. You have the divide between those who have access. You have the divide between those who are consumers and those who are producers. Because having access to the digital instrument is one thing. Using it for productive purpose is another thing. You see in some countries like Uganda where they have tax on internet. And what the government said is that it's a gossip tax to prevent young people spending the whole day on YouTube instead of using the digital instrument for something productive. And then the third divide, you have the divide between the predators and the victims, because we tend to ignore how much violence you can see on internet these days that keep women out of it because they want to protect themselves. How does government make the digital platform safe for young girls to navigate? The other thing that I want to say is a Buy From Women program that some countries have tried. You see in Kenya, in Uganda, in some other countries where government says, we want to promote women's businesses, women-owned and women-controlled businesses by setting up a minimum quota for purchase from those companies. This is something that we have seen in elections in terms of women accessing elective posts where they have quota. And it's now migrating into the economy with very, very interesting results. But I was talking about half policies. When you set up a quota like that, where you say we want to purchase 30% of any government bids or any government procurement from women, then you need to accompany this with technical support, because the customers will not be happy with a produce that is half quality. So these women that benefit from that the opportunity needs to be supported technically so that the produce will not suffer from. And that is something that a call that we are sending to the private sector to ensure that these government initiatives are not just left for government, but are taken up by the private sector, so that women are not just benefiting from just what you call corporate social responsibility, but women are rather brought into the core business of corporate worlds.
Sure.
So that will be the call for you.
Yes, sir. And I think I'd just add to that in terms of the digital divide that you have spoken about, the digital divide that can potentially exist between those that are enabled and those with other abilities. I was actually introduced to this way of thinking yesterday. I met a gentleman who said that those who are traditionally regarded as disabled do not necessarily see themselves in this way. It's not necessarily a disability, but it is this ability. And I do know that there are areas of divide where technology only favors a certain group of enabled people and not those with other abilities, and therefore this, to your point, governments and the private sector also need to ask themselves, how do they, going forward, ensure that inclusion is spread for all groups with all abilities? But you mentioned the private sector, and Roberto, if I can just come to you, sir, given how important the private sector will be in enabling a lot of these businesses to operate, by virtue of the fact that the private sector will have a role to play in bringing a lot of these businesses into the supply chain, and enabling a lot of these businesses to scale, perhaps even through partnerships. So there was a call for the private sector to do more. Why isn't the private sector doing more, in your view, and what should be done to enable private capital to move a bit more in the space?
Well, we are in a sector of prototype industries, right? We are a prototype industry, and it's very hard for you to constantly move your equipment and move your resources. So One of our reasons of success, one, as I mentioned, is our workforce, and the second one is actually it's the supply chain and the partners in the countries. On a project of large scale like the one we have done in Malawi of close to 1 billion euros, we relied significantly on local supply chains, and that fostered the growth of several let's say satellite service providers, right? So in large core projects like we try to do, there's always the need for us to find and identify local suppliers and local service providers. You cannot just bring everything. That's not possible, and not even viable and sustainable. So we always focus and try and in country identify reliable partners, and that is one of the second reason of our success. So, and we've been extremely successful because especially in remote areas, if you don't identify those who can work with you, it will be difficult. We just mobilized for a mine in Mali, and most of the initial equipment that was there was by a subcontractor and a service provider. Same thing happened when we started building the first the refurbishment of Kigali Airport. We relied on local partners. So it's important to one capacitate SMEs, but it's also important to work with them in the generation of business, right? We can foster and teach, but it's also important to pass to action and to practice, and this is one of the things that we focus on.
All right. MEC, I'm back with you, sir. As we head towards the finish line with this conversation, you had mentioned a few things that KZN had on the go to assist the further development of young business. So, is it enough? Because we can all talk about what we are currently doing, and probably the list is extensive. Is it enough in your view, and what further action will you and your team have to take to actually move the dial in a country where, according to some statistics, we've got 78% of young people presently outside of employment? So,
no, thank you very much. I think that's the crux of the challenge, is how to take it to scale and how to massify. And to do that, I think we need to find the best practices. But before I get to that, I just want to pick up on some things that have been said. I don't know about you, Doctor, but generally our age group belong to the technological ignoramuses, right? I feel very inadequate quite often, and I'm not shy to say it. But that's not so with the young people. And that's a strength we need to pick up on. When we analyze the economy post or immediately COVID started to bite deep, and there were three sectors that did reasonably well. That was agriculture, because they were not affected by lockdown and it was an essential service.
we had to eat.
Yes, exactly. And then it was the IT sector, which showed multiple growth. And we all know why. Everything is virtual and everything is technology these days. And the third was pharmaceuticals. It's a pandemic. It's all around the health issues, and the pharmaceutical sector showed tremendous growth. Now, I'm saying this because we need to analyze those sectors that have the potential and direct our young people to it, or for them to choose which sectors which are going to show the greatest potential. So we disaggregated our economy in KZN into 14 sectors. I keep saying that we mustn't have a spray and pray approach. We must have a targeted approach. So if there's a sector of the economy that's not really strong in our province, then we're not going to put significant resources into it. And young people must then be able to choose that particular sector which think they have the interest, it gives them some vibe. And just on the last point on technology, those of you who are going to go through the exhibitions, look out for a chap called Nati Mbele, who used the TV spectrum spaces, it's called the TV white space, And he was then able to set up internet access for an entire rural area, what we call an entire traditional area, in numbers that will probably, it's one of the biggest areas, KwaZulu, and it's probably 100,000 people. And through that mechanism is able to provide internet access, and they're convinced that they're going to be able to commercialize it at a level that's going to be much more affordable than the big boys are providing it in the big cities. So that's the kind of inspiring example we need to use to build on. But I also want to say that when I was there yesterday at the launch of the youth startups, and we were preaching these programs that we have, which you want me to come to, and I think the Premier spoke about it, 300 million rand directed 1,029 SMMEs throughout the province getting the benefit, not cash. That's a lesson we've learned, and that when you give cash, the accountability becomes a bit gray, and we're not always sure that the money is used for the correct purpose to develop the business. So in this particular case, we're funding equipment. Now, there's a young lady from Cameroon who got up and said, no, we're very excited about this, but there's too many experiences of where these what she called the top-down programs, in their opinion, do not reach the real people and help the connected, as she put it. So that's a very diplomatic way of saying that let's not corrupt these initiatives. And in my view, the only way we're going to be able to defeat that is to have absolute transparency in the way beneficiaries are chosen. Because it can't just be, first come, first serve. You've got to choose those who have shown some ability and talent in order to succeed at the next step of receiving the benefit of this program. So that's something we need to talk about. She suggested, for example, that it should not be a top-down, but the decision-making should be at local level. I'm not convinced that that is sufficient, because you could easily have corrupting influences at the local level, sometimes even more so. I'm suggesting complete transparency in the process is the only way, and that's a conversation we need to have. The last point I want to make is we are embracing a huge challenge. I mean, the AfCFTA and the whole African agenda is a huge challenge. That's why we got it to 2063. Agenda 2063, and we need to learn how to bite it in chewable chunks, right? And I always use the climate change approach to say, how do we do it? To fast forward to my conclusion in the argument is we have to have an effective monitoring and evaluation framework. So if we are saying now that we are between 16 to 18% only on our intra-continental trade, compared to 60 to 80% in other parts of the world, then what are we aiming for? Can we say, for example, that in the next 5 years we want to move that 18% to 25 and 30%, and more importantly, how are we going to do that? In which sectors are we going to do that? And what targets we're going to set for ourselves in each of our countries? In that way, it's a macro issue, but in that way, the young people will then get a fair share of that growth that we are trying to build. Right. One final example, sorry.
I thought that was the final one.
Clothing and textiles, this is an important one. At one stage, we used to employ 300,000 people in the clothing and textile industry in this province. That dropped to 43,000, and primarily because of the flood of cheap imports from other parts of the world. So it's a trade and tariff issue. But also, I think our national department responded very creatively and created a national clothing and textile master plan, and then committed all the major chain stores to push their local content from 30% to 65% in a period of time. Now, so those chain stores now are compelled to look for local producers to put onto their shelves. And already we're seeing it going up to 90,000, and we want to work back to the 300,000.
I think that COVID even helped in that regard, not being able to get product in and the delays that we experienced. I think some of those local stores, even within themselves, have taken their own steps and have placed targets of their own to increase the supply at home that they can control a lot better than globally. But just as we prepare to close this discussion, just some final thoughts from you, Commissioner. Just, Ravi, you touched on transparency and the importance thereof, and you looked back at what had been done previously and threw forward to how it can be done differently. And Honorable Suko, I'd like to ask the same from you. You identified the challenges of Cross River State. You mentioned the issues around capacity. But as we, or as you, not me, as you now prepare your young people to trade with markets beyond Cross River State, but a huge continent with huge ability and potential, what will you be doing differently to ensure that those young businesses are in a better position to succeed?
Thank you very much. The African Continental Trade Agreement has an objective which seeks to eliminate or reduce the barriers, the tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade effectively among the 54 member countries and effectively creating one of the largest single markets. Now, that works for Africa if it is driven by Africans. I say that to say this. I started off with statistics as to the youth demographic and in terms of the fact that they are the people, the key success factors for how successful the trade agreements will be. What we need to do is to ensure that there's a lot of sensitization about the trade agreement. If that wasn't done during the formulation, the policy formulation, if that was done, excellent. But if that wasn't done comprehensively enough, there is a need for sensitization at the local level, at the grassroots level. And the rural, the provincial towns, people need to know about this trade agreement. They need to be emotionally involved, actively involved, and just by the sheer providence of age and the logic of time, they have the greatest stake in this trade agreement because they have more active years of service and in commerce. I belong to that youth demographic, and I would like to think that we would want to be actively involved. Now, there are certain limitations in business that youths usually have. One is access to cheap capital. Most of the countries in Africa have weak infrastructure in terms of power, in terms of roads to provide logistics, water, and other inputs required in production or in commerce. There's a need for countries in Africa to deliberately set out to empower, to build capacity among the young people, provide access to capital. Now, not just access to capital, but it's important that they set up a framework that gets rid of adverse selection, the moral hazards of giving money to the wrong people, and ensure that the money gets to the right people who have ventures in which they intend to pursue. If we do not do this effectively and efficiently, the truth is what may end up happening is that while the trade agreement is good, you may have a scenario where foreigners to the continent come into the continent, set up with as little footprint as possible on the continent, produce locally, trade unrestricted, but repatriate the value out of the continent. So there is a need for the young people to be the champions of AfCFTA, and that starts at the grassroots level by sensitization, building capacity, and providing access to capital.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, agreed. Jennifer, just to the point of the thriving industries under COVID, as it were, that are industries that I believe most analysts think will continue to have growth, technology, pharmaceuticals, as well as agriculture. For young people wanting to set up shop in those businesses, ma'am, what do you think needs to change going forward to enable a more active and more thriving startup culture on the continent?
Well, I think first and foremost, the issue of trade is about goods moving across borders, the pharmaceuticals, particularly in this era of COVID. I would like to take it up to a really high policy level to say the member states need to come to an agreement, I think, on the Africa passport. so that there is free movement of goods and services and people across the continent, because I think that's really fundamentally very, very important. We are looking at post-COVID recovery activities, and at NEPAD we have the homegrown solutions activities, which is an acceleration for businesses to be able to enter the market and get assistance through interaction with health experts, particularly when we look at the pharmaceuticals. So I think these are some of the issues that we would have to look at. Of course, I think particular policies that are really aimed towards building up this sector need to be put in place, and they need to have coherence with national development plans. I think that's a very important aspect as well.
Yes, yes, I agree. Last but not least, to the youngest person on this panel. And I'm going to put you on the spot because while we don't have a lot of young people in this room, I have noticed quite a lot of suits, very nice suits and very nice high heels, and I'm making the assumption that these are individuals who do have influence within their respective capacities. And therefore, Maudu, can you leave us with a final message as to how should many of the influential people in this room, as well as those seated on this panel, approach the issue of driving further youth engagement on the continent differently to achieve better success tomorrow?
Again, dissertation question. I think, honestly, for a lot of young people like myself, we see this issue in a very simple way, because I think the issue of youth empowerment or including youth has been expanded so much that it now includes so many things that frankly I think are borderline irrelevant, at best sort of tokenism and trivial. And I think what we actually need to be focused on are two things essentially, is economic well-being of young people and political inclusion or empowerment of young people. And these are the two main things. I mean, I know, and I'll just allude to it, I'm not going to go into it, but, recently another discussion in this country has been raised around, what does power actually mean and what does empowerment really mean and how far has this country come and so on. I'll leave that right there and not go any further. But that teaches you a lesson as to where does power actually lie. Because a lot of young people are very much interested in governance, politics, and so on. And that is important. But you can have political power, but if you have no economic power, are you truly empowered? And that's, I think, the message that I want to leave people with is, how do we truly empower young people economically? So I'll give you an example, right? I found that, now that sort of I've worked with governments, I find that the process for procurement, for lending out contracts, tenders, and so on, is done in the same way you think about who to invite to dinner. Is, oh, I like this guy. This guy did a great job last time. Let's get him again. But what that does is you're not creating opportunities for new people to come into the system and get opportunities to be able to be a part of the procurement system. And in many of the countries that we're from, for the people here that are from Africa, the government, unfortunately or fortunately, is the biggest contract giver in many of these countries. So having a government contract is the holy grail. In that case, there's a sort of outsized pressure on the government to create a more level playing field. Because for young people, we're not asking for handouts. We're not saying give us because we're young. All we're saying is give us an opportunity, and then we'll be able to take it from there and run with the baton.
Nothing further to add there. No handouts. All we're asking for is opportunity. And with that note, I'd like to give my panelists a round of applause for their wonderful insights.